Today we'll be reviewing how to calculate time-weighted and money-weighted rates of returns. These are important concepts you'll need to know for level 1 of the CFA exam, and these concepts are found in quantitative methods. First, let's start with the money-weighted rate of return. The money-weighted rate of return accounts for when money is invested and provides a return on investment. The money-weighted rate of return will look better when large amounts of money are invested right before a period of high returns, and will look worse when large amounts are invested right before a period of poor investment returns. The money-weighted rate of return gives more weight to periods where more capital is invested. It reflects both timing and the size of cash flows, unlike the time-weighted rate of return, which isolates the portfolio's performance from the investor's contribution timing. The internal rate of return is the discount rate at which the sum of the net present value of the cash flows will equal zero. The internal rate of return is equivalent to the money-weighted rate of return. Let's jump into a few practice questions to figure out how to use the money-weighted rate of return. Suppose an investor invests $500 in ABC Mutual Fund at the beginning of the first year. The return in the first year is negative 20%. Ouch. The investor then invests another 1,000 at the beginning of the second year. The return for ABC Mutual Fund in year 2 is 30%. The investor withdraws 200 at the end of year 2. The return in year 3 is 24%. Let's calculate the money-weighted rate of return for this investor. To solve this problem, we'll begin by mapping out the cash flows for this scenario. We started with a $0 balance at the beginning of year 1 and then invested $500. Since the fund declined 20% in year 1, the investment loss was $100. The balance at the end of the first year is $400 since no withdrawals were made. For the second year, we start with a balance of $400, and since the investor made a $1,000 investment, the new balance at the beginning of year 2 is $1,400. The investor made $420 in year 2 since the fund returned 30%. 200 was withdrawn at the end of year 2, so the balance at the end of year 2 is $1,620. The investor then made $388.80 in year 3, leaving a balance of $2,008.80. First, let's map out the cash flows for this problem. The cash flow at time 0 is $500, since the investor invested $500 at the beginning of year 1. The cash flow at time 1 would be $1,000 since another investment was made at the beginning of year 2. Since $200 was withdrawn at the end of year 2, the cash flow at time 2 is plus $200 since that is a gain for the investor. Finally, the cash flow at time 3 is $2,008.80 since that is the balance that is left over after year 3. Here's how to solve this problem using a Texas Instruments BA2 Plus calculator. First, press the CF button on the calculator to start entering the cash flows. Enter the first cash flow of $500 and make sure it's negative since it's an outflow for the investor. Hit the Enter button, then press the down arrow to enter the cash flow for time 1. We enter negative 1,000 for the time 1 cash flow and plus 200 for cash flow at time 2, and $2,008.80 for the cash flow at time 3. Once you have entered all the cash flows, press the IRR button, then press the CPT button, this is the compute button, at the top left of the calculator. Once we do this, we find the IRR, or money-weighted rate of return, to be 18.72%. Let's look at another practice problem involving the money-weighted rate of return. At the beginning of year 1, an investor purchases 100 shares of ABC stock for $20 per share. At the end of year 1, this investor purchases an additional 100 shares at $25. At the end of year 2, this investor sells all his shares in ABC for $30 per share. ABC stock paid a dividend of $1 per share in each of the last 2 years. Let's assume the dividend is not reinvested. What is the money-weighted rate of return for this investor? Take a minute or pause the video to see if you can solve this problem. Again, let's map out the cash flows to solve this problem. The cash flow at time zero would be negative 2,000 since the investor bought 100 shares of ABC at 20 per share. Remember, the cash flow is negative since it's an outflow for the investor. At the end of year one, the investor would have received $100 in dividends and then purchased an additional 100 shares of stock for $2,500. The problem states the dividend is not reinvested, so this is a positive cash inflow for the investor. Positive 100 in dividends less the 2,500 invested equals a cash outflow of 2,400 at time one. At the end of year two, the investor receives $200 in dividends and sells the 200 shares for $30 per share. The total cash inflow for the investor at time two is $6,200. Using the same process we did to solve the last problem, we plug the cash flows into our calculator, then hit the IRR and compute buttons to find the money weighted return, or IRR, for this investor. We see that if you plug these cash flows in, hit that IRR button, and then the compute button, you'll find the IRR for this investor is 26.01%. So B is the correct answer. The time-weighted rate of return shows the compounded growth rate of a portfolio, much like the geometric return. The time-weighted rate of return is a preferred performance measurement method because it ignores the effects of cash additions and withdrawals into and out of a portfolio. Cash additions and withdrawals are often out of the control of a portfolio manager. Let's look at one more practice problem to utilize the time-weighted rate of return. Suppose a hedge fund posted the following returns for the last 5 years. First, calculate the 5-year holding period return for this fund. Second, how much would $100 invested in this fund be worth after 5 years? Finally, what is the time-weighted rate of return or compound annual return for this fund? First, to find the 5-year holding period for this fund, simply add 1 to each year's returns, then multiply each of the sums and subtract 1. We find that the holding period return was roughly 59.89% for this fund. $100 invested in this fund would have turned into $159.89 after 5 years. To find the time-weighted or compound annual return, we raise the product of each year's annual returns plus 1 to the power of 1 over n. Since n in this case is 5, raise 1.5989 to the power of 1 divided by 5, then subtract 1 to get the time-weighted compound return of 9.84%. Thank you for watching the video. Please like the video and subscribe for more CFA Test Prep videos and other CFA-related educational content.